Envision standing on a hillside in the north of Ireland. The year is around 403 AD. The air is damp and sharp, carrying the smell of peat smoke and sea salt drifting in from the coast. Beneath you, sheep move through the long grass in slow, indifferent clusters. There are no roads here, no towns, no churches, no written language spoken by the people of this island. The sky above is wide and grey, pressing down toward the horizon in every direction. It is cold. It is lonely. And somewhere on this hillside, a 16-year-old boy from Roman Britain is now a slave in this unknown place. He has been here for 3 years already. 3 years since the Irish raiders came ashore on the western coast of Britain and swept him away from everything he had ever known. 3 years of sleeping in the open, of tending another man's animals, of learning a foreign tongue, not from books or teachers, but from sheer necessity. His name, as best we can render it from his own later account, was Patricius. Most of the world would come to know him simply as Patrick. Tonight, we are going to follow this one remarkable life and trace the extraordinary chain of events it set in motion. We will travel from the crumbling edges of the Roman Empire to the monasteries of medieval Ireland, and then across an ocean to the teeming immigrant streets of 19th century America. We will discover how a minor religious feast day was transformed over the course of 15 centuries into a global celebration observed on every inhabited continent. We will meet the real man behind the legend, pull back the layers of myth and marketing, and find something even more interesting underneath. This is a story about faith and survival, about the strange persistence of culture across disaster, and about how a people who suffered one of the greatest catastrophes of the modern era refused to be forgotten. It is one of the most fascinating journeys in history. So settle in, let the day fall away, and let us begin at the very beginning. To understand Patrick, you first need to understand the world that made him, because it was a world in the process of collapse. The Western Roman Empire in the early 5th century was still standing, just barely. Its borders stretched from the cold mists of northern Britain to the baking deserts of North Africa, from the Atlantic coast of Iberia to the great rivers of the Germanic frontier. But the machinery that held this vast territory together was grinding to a halt. The armies were underpaid and overstretched. The tax base was eroding. Emperors rose and fell with alarming speed, many of them assassinated within months of taking power. Patrick was born somewhere in the western part of Britain, most likely in what we now call Wales or the northwest of England, around the year 387 AD. His family was comfortable by the standards of late Roman provincial life. His father, Calpurnius, held a minor civic office and was a deacon in the Christian church. His grandfather had been a priest. They owned a small estate. Patrick himself, as he later confessed with some embarrassment, paid relatively little attention to his faith growing up. He was a typical teenager of the Roman provincial world, more interested in the rhythms of daily life than in the demands of religion. Britain at this time was still recognizably Roman, even as the empire frayed at the edges. Roman roads still connected its towns. Roman law still governed its courts. Roman coins still passed through its markets. But the legions that had once kept the island secure were thinning year by year. pulled away to fight fires on other frontiers. And across the grey water of the Irish Sea, a people who had never been conquered by Rome were watching with considerable interest. The Irish, whom the Romans called the Scotti, were skilled seafarers and fearless raiders. They had been making increasingly bold incursions along the western coast of Britain for decades, exploiting the progressive weakening of Roman defences. These were not disorganized bands of opportunists. They were calculated operations led by experienced chieftains who understood that a Roman province stripped of its garrison was an extraordinary source of slaves, livestock, and portable wealth. Villages along the coast had learned to be afraid. Patrick's family had not learned to be afraid enough. Or perhaps they simply could not imagine that the raiders would reach as far inland as their estate. Whatever the reason, when the Irish ships came ashore sometime around the year 403, the boy Patricius was among the thousands taken captive. He was 16 years old. He would not see Britain again for 6 years. The slave ships crossed the Irish Sea, and Patrick arrived in a country unlike anything in his experience. There were no Roman roads here, no amphitheatres, no bathhouses, no forums, no temples built of cut stone. Ireland was a landscape of farms and forests, of small kingdoms ruled by chieftains whose authority rested on cattle, on clientship, on a complex web of obligation and honour. The island was governed not by Roman law, but by an ancient and sophisticated body of tradition known as the Brehon laws, administered by a trained intellectual class called the Druids, who served simultaneously as judges, historians, theologians, and poets. Patrick was sold to a chieftain named Miliach, somewhere in the north of the island, in the region we now call County Antrim. His job was simple and grinding: tend the sheep. Day after day, season after season, he moved the animals across the hillsides, keeping them from straying, protecting them from wolves, sleeping rough through the long, wet Irish winters. He was alone for much of the time, profoundly, absolutely alone in a way that is difficult for people living in the connected modern world to fully imagine. It was in this solitude that something happened to Patrick, something that would eventually change the history of an entire continent. He found his faith, not in the formal, inherited way his father and grandfather had held theirs, the comfortable faith of men who attend church on the appropriate days and say the appropriate prayers without necessarily feeling much beneath the surface. What Patrick found on those hillsides was altogether more urgent. He later wrote that he prayed constantly, sometimes 100 times in a single day, and nearly as many times through the night, rising before dawn in rain and frost and snow, because the need to pray felt like something he could not resist. This transformation is not hard to understand. He was a teenage boy ripped from everything familiar, living in a foreign country whose language he was only beginning to master, with no family, no community, no prospect of rescue that he could see. In that kind of isolation, in that kind of helplessness, the interior life becomes the only territory that cannot be taken from you. Patrick turned inward and found something extraordinary waiting there. He would spend the rest of his life trying to describe it, and the two texts he left behind, the Confession and the letter to the soldiers of Coroticus, still vibrate with the intensity of a man who felt he had touched something real. 6 years passed. The seasons turned on those northern hillsides with their particular Irish character. The springs lush and waterlogged, the summers brief and unreliable, the autumns full of a golden light that seems to arrive as compensation for everything a year has put you through, the winters long and dark and pressing. Patrick endured them all, and then one night he heard a voice in his sleep. It told him that his ship was ready, that it was time to go home. What followed was an act of either extraordinary courage or extraordinary desperation, possibly both. Patrick walked. He walked roughly 200 miles across an island where he was property, where being recaptured would mean punishment at best and death at worst, across terrain he only partially knew, toward a coast where he had been told in a dream that a ship was waiting. He had no map, no guide, no guarantee that the voice he had heard was anything more than a product of exhaustion and longing. But the ship was there. It was loaded with Irish hunting dogs, those large, ferocious hounds that were prized across the Roman world for their speed and power in the hunt. The sailors spoke a language Patrick could follow. He negotiated passage. There was a tense moment when the captain initially refused him, but Patrick prayed, and shortly afterwards one of the sailors called him back. The ship sailed. He was going home. The journey was not simple. They landed somewhere on the continent, almost certainly in Gaul, and spent several days moving through a landscape that had been devastated by barbarian incursion. Food was scarce. The sailors were desperate. At some point, in what Patrick records as a matter of simple fact rather than drama, wild pigs appeared on the road ahead of them. The men ate, recovered their strength, and eventually reached safety. Patrick was reunited with his family in Britain, who received him with tears and begged him never to leave again. He intended to stay. He was free. He was home. He had survived something that would have destroyed most people, and every reasonable instinct must have been telling him to settle back into the life that had been stolen from him, to rebuild, to rest, to forget Ireland as completely as he could manage. But Ireland would not let him go, not entirely. Sometime after his return, Patrick had a dream so vivid and so specific that it stayed with him for the rest of his life. In the dream, a man came to him from Ireland carrying letters. One of those letters was headed, "The Voice of the Irish." As Patrick began to read, he heard voices, many voices, calling to him from a forest near the Western Sea. They were pleading with him to come back. "Come back and walk among us," they called. "Walk among us once more." Patrick woke from this dream with a conviction that settled into him like a stone into water. He was supposed to return to Ireland, not as a slave this time, but as a missionary. He was supposed to bring the Christian faith to the people who had enslaved him. He recognized immediately how strange this was, how countercultural, how impractical, how by any reasonable measure slightly mad. He also recognized that he was going to do it anyway. Before Patrick could return to Ireland as a missionary, he needed proper ecclesiastical authority. He went to study, spending years absorbing the theology and Latin of the Church, working to repair the educational gaps left by his 6 years of slavery. He was honest, painfully honest, about how those gaps never quite closed. He writes in the confession with genuine embarrassment about the roughness of his Latin, apologizing to the reader for what he sees as his inadequate style, comparing himself unfavorably to the polished clerics he encountered in the church. This honesty is one of the most striking things about Patrick's surviving writings. He could so easily have presented himself as a hero, a chosen vessel, a man whose every act was guided by divine certainty. Instead, he presents a man riddled with doubt, tormented by his own inadequacy, perpetually worried that he is not equal to the task he has accepted. He had been a slave. He was not a scholar. His Latin was serviceable at best. Who was he to think he could convert an entire island? There was also a painful episode involving a confession of sin. In his youth, before he entered the priesthood, Patrick had confided something to a close friend, some act or thought from his teenage years in Britain that troubled his conscience. He does not tell us what it was. Years later, when Patrick was being considered for his missionary work, that same friend revealed Patrick's confession to a gathering of senior clergy, apparently in an effort to discredit him or block his appointment. Patrick was devastated. He writes about this betrayal with a rawness that still resonates across 15 centuries. The pain is not primarily about the sin itself, which he seems to have regarded as settled between himself and God. It is the betrayal by someone he trusted, the weaponizing of a private confidence against him in a public forum. He recovered, eventually. He was ordained a bishop, probably sometime in the 430s, and he set sail for Ireland with the authority he needed. The Ireland that Patrick returned to was not, contrary to popular myth, a spiritual blank slate waiting to be written on. Christianity had already reached the island before his arrival. There was a small Christian community in the south, significant enough that Rome had sent a bishop named Palladius to minister to them in 431 AD. Palladius's mission appears to have met with limited success and limited enthusiasm, and he died or withdrew relatively quickly. Patrick came with a different mandate and, crucially, a different approach. What gave Patrick an advantage that no other missionary to Ireland could have claimed was his 6 years as a slave. He spoke the Irish language fluently. He understood Irish society from the inside, not as an outsider making observations from a distance, but as a man who had lived within it, had learned its customs and hierarchies, had developed relationships across its social fabric. He knew how things worked. He knew who the people were who needed to be convinced, and he knew something of how to convince them. His strategy was to work from the top down. Irish society was intensely hierarchical, organized around kings and chieftains whose decisions shaped the choices available to everyone beneath them. If you could persuade a king to convert, or at minimum to permit the preaching of the new faith within his territory, you had opened a door that might admit thousands. Patrick was shrewd about this. He brought gifts for the kings he visited, understanding that gift-giving was the essential social lubricant of Irish society, the mechanism by which relationships of trust and obligation were established. The most famous confrontation in Patrick's missionary career took place at Tara, the great ceremonial hill in County Meath that served as the symbolic seat of the High Kings of Ireland. The story goes that Patrick lit a paschal fire on the nearby hill of Slane, in direct defiance of a royal prohibition against lighting fires before the king's own ceremonial flame was kindled. The High King Loeger was furious. He sent men to deal with this insolent priest. Patrick survived the encounter through a combination of confidence, eloquence, and what his supporters interpreted as miraculous protection. The king did not convert, but he gave Patrick permission to preach throughout his territory. It was enough. Across the island, Patrick moved with extraordinary energy. He baptized thousands, ordained clergy, established churches, consecrated women as dedicated virgins of the church. He traveled constantly, pushing into regions that no previous missionary had reached, navigating the dangerous politics of a landscape divided among hundreds of competing chieftains and minor kings. He was captured at least once, held for 2 weeks before being released. He was threatened, mocked, and robbed. He paid bribes from his own funds, accepting the financial burden as the cost of doing business in a society where relationships were sealed with material exchange. The scale of what Patrick accomplished in purely logistical terms is remarkable even before you consider the spiritual dimension. Ireland, in the 5th century, had no roads in the Roman sense, no network of paved highways that would allow a traveller to move predictably from one point to another. Movement across the island meant following ancient trackways through forest and bog, fording rivers, negotiating the hospitality of kingdoms, where a stranger's reception depended entirely on the goodwill of local rulers who had no obligation to provide it. Patrick moved through all of this decade after decade, building what he called his network of clergy with the systematic patience of a man who understood that the work was going to outlast him and that its foundations therefore needed to be solid. He trained local men for the priesthood, which was itself a significant cultural act. The Druids, who had maintained Irish religious and intellectual life, had always been Irish. The priests Patrick ordained were Irish too. He was not trying to impose a foreign church on a conquered people, but to plant something that would eventually grow Irish roots and stand on its own. This instinct for local adaptation would prove to be one of the great strengths of the Irish Church in the centuries that followed, producing a form of Christianity that was distinctively and recognizably Irish in its character, its artwork, its scholarship, and its sense of what the faith was for. And he did something that was genuinely radical for the era. He spoke out against slavery. Not in the abstract philosophical way that Roman moralists sometimes condemned the institution while continuing to benefit from it, but personally and specifically using his own money to ransom enslaved people, drawing directly on his own experience of captivity to articulate why the reduction of a human being to property was fundamentally incompatible with the faith he was preaching. In a world that had accepted slavery as an immovable feature of social organization for millennia, this was a remarkable and courageous position. Here we must pause for a moment, because somewhere between Patrick's actual life and the saint's life that the medieval Irish Church constructed around his memory, a great deal of creative embroidery was added to the original cloth. The Patrick of popular tradition is a towering miracle worker, a man who drove the snakes out of Ireland, who used a shamrock to explain the Trinity, who stood on mountaintops communing with angels and wresting concessions from God himself. It is worth looking at each of these in turn. The snakes are the most famous story and the most easily explained. Ireland has no native snakes. It never has had. The Irish Sea formed after the last ice age, before snake populations could migrate from continental Europe, and they never made it across. There were no snakes for Patrick to drive out. The story almost certainly began as a metaphor. In early Christian symbolism, the serpent was the enemy of faith, the embodiment of paganism and evil. Saying that Patrick drove the snakes out of Ireland was a way of saying that he drove out the old religion. At some point, the metaphor calcified into literal truth, and generations of people who should have known better have been repeating it ever since. The shamrock story is more ambiguous. Patrick may well have used some small plant with 3 leaves to illustrate the doctrine of the Trinity, the idea that Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are 3 distinct persons within a single divine nature. It is exactly the kind of concrete, locally grounded teaching aid that a skilled missionary would reach for when trying to explain a complex theological concept to an audience encountering it for the first time. Whether it was specifically a shamrock, and whether the story grew in the telling over the centuries that followed, is impossible to say with confidence. The earliest written references to the shamrock teaching appear in texts composed hundreds of years after Patrick's death. What we can say with confidence is that Patrick himself, in his own words, does not perform a single miracle. The confession and the letter to the soldiers of Coroticus are not the writings of a man who wants to impress you with his powers. They are the writings of a man who wants to explain himself, to justify his life's choices to people who questioned them, to express his gratitude for a grace he felt he had done nothing to earn. They are among the most psychologically honest documents to survive from the 5th century, and they give us a Patrick who is more interesting than any miracle worker. A man who was frightened and faithful, uncertain and unstoppable. The letter to the soldiers of Coroticus deserves particular mention. Late in his life, Patrick wrote a furious letter to a British warlord named Coroticus, whose soldiers had raided a group of newly baptized Irish Christians, killing some and enslaving the rest. Patrick was incandescent. He formally excommunicated Coroticus and his men, demanding the return of the captives. The letter crackles with indignation across 15 centuries. Here was Patrick, the former slave, watching the people he had spent his life serving being dragged into the chains he had once worn, by men who called themselves Christians. It was a personal outrage as much as a theological one. He never softened or retracted a word of it. Patrick died sometime around the year 460 AD, though the precise date, like almost everything in his story, is disputed. Where he was buried is equally contested. Downpatrick in County Down claims the honour, and a large granite stone in the grounds of the cathedral there marks the traditional site. But Armagh, which became the seat of the Irish Church and considered itself his primary foundation, also has a strong claim. Glastonbury in England, that great collector of holy associations, has put its hand up as well. We will probably never know for certain. What Patrick left behind was more important than any grave. He left a church imperfectly established but firmly rooted, spreading steadily through a society that had shown itself receptive in ways that surprised even its creator. He left a tradition of learning, and he left, in the monasteries that sprang up in the generations following his death, something that would have consequences far beyond the island of Ireland. The great Irish monasteries of the 6th and 7th centuries became, quite unexpectedly, among the most important intellectual institutions in the Western world. While the collapse of the Roman Empire was pulling the continent into what historians used to call the Dark Ages, a period of widespread disruption in which learning contracted and literacy declined, and the accumulated knowledge of antiquity was in genuine danger of being lost, the Irish monks were copying. They copied manuscripts with the focused devotion of people who understood that this work was sacred. Latin texts, Greek texts, theological commentaries, classical literature, the entire written inheritance of the civilization that had sent a slave ship to steal their patron saint. Out of this tradition came some of the most breathtaking works of art the medieval world produced. The Book of Kells, created around 800 AD, is the supreme example. Open it today in Trinity College, Dublin, where it lives under controlled light behind protective glass, and you are looking at something that defies easy description. The complexity of the interlace patterns, the jewel-like intensity of the colors, the tiny figures nested within the swirling geometry, the pages that seem less like parchment and more like windows into another order of reality altogether. It was made by human hands, by monks who spent years bent over individual pages with tools finer than a surgeon's instruments. And it grew directly from the tradition that Patrick began on those Irish hillsides. The monasteries were not silent, cloistered places turned entirely inward. They were, by the standards of the early medieval world, intensely connected. Abbots corresponded with abbots across the continent in a Latin that had become the common tongue of European scholarship. Students came from Britain and Gaul and the Germanic kingdoms to study in Irish foundations, attracted by a reputation for learning that the Irish monasteries had built with impressive speed. The curriculum was broad and rigorous: scripture, theology, Latin grammar, computistics, the complex science of calculating the dates of movable feasts like Easter, and increasingly the classical texts that the Irish monks had begun copying with what seems like prophetic urgency. When Charlemagne later needed scholars to staff his palace school and revive learning across the Frankish kingdom, he turned in significant part to Irishmen. Irish missionaries carried this tradition back to the continent with evangelical energy. Columbus sailed to the Scottish island of Iona in 563 AD and built a monastery that became one of the great spiritual and intellectual centers of northern Europe. Columbanus crossed to Gaul and pushed all the way to the Alps, establishing monasteries at Luxeuil and Bobbio that still carried manuscripts and scholarship centuries later. These were Patrick's spiritual grandchildren, carrying the faith he had planted out into a world that desperately needed what they had to offer. The 17th of March, the date traditionally assigned to Patrick's death, began to be observed in Irish monasteries as a feast day not long after his death. It was a day of prayer, of fasting followed by a special meal, of gratitude for the man who had brought the faith to the island. It was quiet and local and deeply serious. Nothing about it suggested what it would eventually become. For centuries, the feast was observed with this character, varying somewhat in its elaborateness depending on the wealth and size of the monastery or parish marking it, but always essentially religious in nature. The Lenten rules were traditionally relaxed for the day, which meant that meat could be eaten and a modest quantity of alcohol consumed, and this practical dispensation gradually gave the day a slightly festive quality alongside its devotional one. In Ireland itself, pilgrims began making the journey to sites associated with Patrick, particularly Crove Patrick, the mountain in County Mayo, where tradition holds that he fasted for 40 days and prayed for the Irish people. That mountain is still walked every year by tens of thousands of pilgrims on the last Sunday of July, many of them barefoot, in one of the most physically demanding acts of popular devotion in the Western world. For over 1,000 years, St. Patrick's Day remained essentially what it had started as: a religious observance of importance to the Irish, celebrated in Ireland and in Irish monastic communities scattered across Europe, but of little significance to anyone else. The event that changed this was one of the most devastating catastrophes in 19th century European history. To understand the global celebration that March the 17th has become, you must first understand what happened to Ireland between 1845 and 1852. By the early 19th century, Ireland was home to roughly 8 million people, most of them living in rural poverty of a particularly grinding kind. The island was governed from London, its best agricultural land owned largely by absentee English landlords, its Catholic majority barred until 1829 from full participation in political life. The Irish peasantry had, over generations, become almost entirely dependent on a single crop: the potato. This was not stupidity or agricultural conservatism. It was rational adaptation to circumstances. A single acre of potatoes could feed a family of 6 for a year. No other crop could match that yield on the small plots available to the rural poor. The potato kept people alive on very little land at very little cost. In the late summer of 1845, a water mould called Phytophthora infestans arrived in Ireland, probably carried on ships from North America. It spread through the potato fields with terrifying speed. Within weeks, plants that had appeared healthy were black and liquefying, their tubers rotten in the ground, the air above them thick with a smell that survivors would later describe as something between rot and death. The crop failed. Not partially, almost entirely. What followed was catastrophic. The blight returned in 1846, worse than before. It returned again in 1847, the year that became known simply as Black 47, the year when the roads of Ireland filled with people walking away from empty fields toward any town that might offer food, and the ditches along those roads began to fill with those who did not make it. People died of starvation. They died of the diseases that follow starvation: typhus and dysentery spreading through weakened bodies and overcrowded workhouses. They died of exposure, having been evicted from cottages they could no longer pay rent for. They died in the hundreds of thousands. The British government's response was shaped by a prevailing economic ideology that treated interference with the market as dangerous and potentially counterproductive. food continued to be exported from Ireland throughout the famine because it was commercially contracted and the government was reluctant to intervene. Public works programs were established, but designed in ways that were often inadequate to the scale of need. Soup kitchens were eventually opened, but too late and too few. By the time the potato blight finally eased in the early 1850s, approximately 1 million people were dead. 1 in 8 of the entire population of the island, and roughly 2 million had left. They crowded onto the cheapest available ships, vessels so inadequate to the task of carrying human beings across the Atlantic that they earned a name that history has never forgotten: coffin ships. The mortality rates on some of these crossings were appalling, the holds packed with starving people already weakened by months of insufficient food, typhus spreading through the inadequate ventilation, the sea providing one final chance to take those who had survived everything else. Those who arrived in the ports of New York, Boston, Quebec, and Liverpool arrived with essentially nothing: no money, no connections, no skills marketable in an industrial city, many of them unable to speak English at all, only the Irish language that was still the primary tongue of much of the rural West. What they did carry was a memory so specific, so physical, so charged with loss and anger and grief that it shaped the character of Irish communities in the New World for generations. The smell of the rotting fields, the faces of neighbours who had not made it to the ship, the hunger that was not metaphorical but literal, the hunger that had emptied an entire island of a quarter of its people in less than a decade. This is the emotional substrate on which the Irish-American St. Patrick's Day was built. The celebration that the world sees is joyful. The history beneath it is not. Understanding the connection between the two is essential to understanding why the holiday developed the particular intensity it has. Why the green flag carried up Fifth Avenue in March was not just a flag, but a testament. The Irish who arrived in American cities in the 1840s and 1850s found a society that was not particularly pleased to see them. Anti-Catholic sentiment in America ran deep, rooted partly in Protestant religious tradition and partly in a genuinely widespread fear that Catholic immigrants owed their primary loyalty to a foreign power, the Pope in Rome, rather than to the American Republic. The Irish, specifically, were the target of prejudice that expressed itself in everything from social condescension to physical violence. The phrase "no Irish need apply" appeared in job advertisements with such frequency that it became a defining feature of the immigrant experience, a daily reminder that the country of refuge was not the country of welcome. Political cartoonists depicted the Irish as ape-like figures barely removed from animals, carrying jugs of whiskey and causing trouble wherever they went. The Know-Nothing movement of the 1850s built an entire political identity around opposition to Catholic immigration, winning enough support to control several state governments. The nativist hostility was real, sustained, and backed by genuine political power. The Irish had come to America escaping catastrophe, and they found themselves in a country that in significant ways did not want them. Into this context, St. Patrick's Day took on a meaning it had never carried in Ireland. In Ireland, it was a religious feast. In America, it became something else as well: a demonstration, a public assertion, made in the streets of cities that had posted signs against the people now marching through them, that the Irish were present, were united, were proud, and were not going away. The parade was not primarily entertainment. It was a message. Look at us. Count us. We are here. The first recorded St. Patrick's Day parade in America took place in Boston in 1737, organized by Irish Protestant immigrants of a much earlier and more comfortable wave. New York's first parade came in 1762, organized by Irish soldiers serving in the British garrison of the colonial city. These early parades were modest affairs, exercises in nostalgic solidarity rather than political statements. What transformed them was the famine immigration. By the 1850s, the Irish population of New York alone numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The parade had become a demonstration of mass. Political machines noticed immediately. Tammany Hall, the democratic organization that dominated New York City politics for most of the 19th and early 20th centuries, cultivated the Irish vote with methodical attention. Irish immigrants needed work, housing, and the basic navigational assistance required to survive in a completely unfamiliar urban environment. Tammany provided all of these things in exchange for political loyalty. Every March the 17th, the Tammany men marched in the parade in force, wearing green and making speeches, showing the Irish community that their friends were the friends of Ireland. The social dynamics of this relationship were complex and not always admirable. Tammany Hall was not a charitable organization. It was a machine built on patronage and organized corruption, and the Irish community that it served was also a community it exploited, trading genuine services for the kind of bloc voting that kept Tammany bosses in power, regardless of how they governed. But this calculation was not unique to the Irish. It was the logic of immigrant politics in 19th century America. The reality that a community with no existing power had to trade what it had, its votes, for what it needed, jobs and basic protection. The parade was part of this transaction, a visible demonstration of Irish communal solidarity that translated directly into political leverage. The Irish policeman, the Irish fireman, the Irish ward boss. These became stock figures of the American urban landscape in the second half of the 19th century because they represented the specific path that Irish immigrants found through the machinery of the American city. Civil service jobs, labor union leadership, and eventually elected office. Each step represented a claim on American belonging that was also, implicitly, a counterargument to every sign that had ever said, "No Irish need apply." When Patrick Collins became mayor of Boston in 1882, or when Hugh O'Brien preceded him in that office, these were not just political achievements. They were arguments made in the language that the 19th century understood best about who deserved to be considered fully American. The parade up Fifth Avenue grew decade by decade. When St. Patrick's Cathedral was completed on that avenue in 1878, an enormous Gothic structure that announced the arrival of Irish Catholicism as a permanent and confident presence in American public life, the parade found its great stage. The route past the cathedral steps, where the cardinal stands in his robes to review the marchers, has remained essentially unchanged for over a century. Walking that route on a cold March morning with the pipes skirling and the crowd pressed 3 deep against the barriers, is one of the oldest continuous outdoor public ceremonies in the United States. The customs that the world now associates with St. Patrick's Day did not arrive fully formed. They accumulated over time through a series of decisions and accidents and commercial adaptations that transformed a religious feast day into something considerably more complex and considerably more commercial. The colour green, for instance, was not always Patrick's colour. The original colour associated with the saint was a particular shade of blue, sometimes called St. Patrick's blue, visible in early Irish heraldic traditions. Green entered the picture through a more complicated route. The shamrock was green, of course, and green had acquired powerful political associations in Ireland through the United Irishmen, the revolutionary movement of the 1790s that adopted it as their colour in deliberate connection with the Irish landscape. By the time the famine generation arrived in America, green had become so thoroughly identified with Irish identity that the original blue was essentially forgotten. The colour that had once signified rebellion had become the colour of celebration. The corned beef associated with American St. Patrick's Day celebrations is an even more revealing case of cultural adaptation. In Ireland, the traditional festive meal on the 17th of March was salted bacon or lamb, cooked with cabbage and whatever root vegetables were available. Corned beef was not a common Irish food. But in the tenement neighborhoods of New York and Boston, where the Irish lived alongside significant Jewish communities, corned beef was what the local Jewish butchers sold. It was affordable. It was available. It was something you could buy in the same neighborhood where you lived, and it filled the same culinary role as the bacon back home. The Irish adopted it, cooked it the way their mothers had cooked pork, and over generations it became so thoroughly identified with Irish-American tradition that it made its way back across the Atlantic, appearing on pub menus in Dublin as a nod to the diaspora's interpretation of a cuisine they no longer quite shared. The greening of the Chicago River, one of the most visually spectacular St. Patrick's Day traditions in the world, began in 1962 when a plumber named Stephen Bailey discovered that the vegetable-based dye he used to trace leaks in the city's waterways turned the water a vivid green. He mentioned this to a local political figure named Daniel Shannon, who saw the theatrical possibilities immediately. They poured roughly 40 pounds of dye into the river on the morning of St. Patrick's Day and watched the water turn the colour of a very enthusiastic emerald. The crowds who gathered were delighted. The tradition has continued every year since, the river running green for a few hours each March in one of the most improbable and cheerful sights in American civic life. No institution has done more to carry St. Patrick's Day around the world than the Irish pub. This is worth spending a moment on, because the Irish pub is a genuinely distinctive cultural creation that does not quite translate into any other language. In Ireland, the pub was never primarily about drinking. It was about gathering. In rural communities scattered across the boglands and hillsides of a country with very few public spaces, the pub was where news arrived, where arguments were resolved, where songs were remembered and performed, where the thread of communal life was maintained through the regular ritual of sitting together with neighbours in a warm room. The Irish emigrants who left their villages for the cities of the New World carried this need for a gathering place with them, and in every city where they settled in significant numbers, Irish pubs appeared almost immediately. The music that filled those pubs was another form of cultural preservation. The traditional Irish music that had been played at crossroads dances and wedding celebrations in the old country, the reels and jigs and slow airs that contained within their structures something of the emotional landscape of Ireland itself, survived in the diaspora in ways that it struggled to survive in Ireland during the long 19th century, when association with poverty and backwardness sometimes led the Irish themselves to turn away from their own traditions in favour of more respectable cultural forms. In Boston and New York and Chicago, the music was played because it was home, because it was the sound of a place that no longer existed in the form people remembered it. And keeping that sound alive was a way of keeping a piece of themselves intact. On St. Patrick's Day, these functions converged. The pub became the centre of the celebration, the place where the community gathered to be loudly, defiantly, joyfully itself in a city that had spent the rest of the year reminding its Irish inhabitants that they were guests rather than owners. The particular quality of that celebration, raucous and sentimental in equal measure, laughing and weeping sometimes in the same sentence, contains within it the entire history of what brought those people to that room. By the 20th century, St. Patrick's Day had spread far beyond America, carried by the Irish diaspora to every corner of the world where Irish emigrants had put down roots. In Australia, where Irish transportation convicts and then free settlers had created substantial communities in every major city, the parade had been a fixture since the 1810s. Sydney and Melbourne both hold celebrations that draw hundreds of thousands of people, rooted in genuine Irish-Australian heritage stretching back 6 or 7 generations. In Argentina, a significant Irish community established itself in the Buenos Aires province during the 19th century, drawn by the vast pampas grasslands that reminded some of them of the Irish Midlands and offered something Ireland itself had largely denied them: space and the possibility of prosperity. Their descendants still celebrate on March the 17th in the town of Mercedes, which holds what claims to be the largest St. Patrick's Day parade in South America. Newfoundland in Canada occupies a special place in the story. The Irish fishermen who came to work the Grand Banks cod fisheries in the 17th and 18th centuries, primarily from the southeast of Ireland, settled in such numbers that they shaped the accent, the music, and the Catholic culture of the island in ways that remain audible and visible today. The Newfoundland accent preserves vowel sounds and rhythmic patterns that have largely disappeared from contemporary Irish speech. To hear a Newfoundlander speak is sometimes, in certain phrases and inflections, to hear an echo of Ireland. Japan has been holding a St. Patrick's Day parade in Tokyo since 1992. The procession through the Omotesando district, one of the city's most fashionable shopping streets, features Japanese participants alongside expats, Japanese school brass bands playing reels, and faces of every description painted in green and white. The enthusiasm is genuine and completely unironic. St. Patrick's Day in Tokyo is a celebration of Irishness by many who have no Irish ancestry, though adopted because the form of the celebration, the music and colour and public joy, turned out to be universally appealing regardless of its specific origins. In Ireland itself, the relationship with the holiday underwent a long and interesting evolution. For most of the 20th century, St. Patrick's Day in Ireland was a comparatively modest and genuinely religious occasion. The pubs were legally required to close until the late 1970s. The parade in Dublin was a civic event rather than a spectacle. Irish people were sometimes slightly bemused, occasionally slightly irritated, by the exuberant green carnival that their diaspora had built in their name on the other side of the Atlantic. That, some felt, was not quite what Patrick's Day was supposed to be. This changed dramatically in the 1990s. The decade saw Ireland undergo an economic transformation so rapid and so complete that the country barely recognized itself by the end of it. Foreign investment, membership of the European Union, a young and unusually well-educated workforce, and a series of fortunate policy decisions combined to produce the Celtic Tiger, an economy growing at rates that other European nations could barely credit. The country that had exported emigrants for 2 centuries began importing them instead. A generation of Irish people who had expected to leave discovered that they could stay, and even found that people from other countries wanted to come join them. In this mood of extraordinary self-confidence, Ireland reclaimed its holiday. The government and Dublin City Council developed what became the St. Patrick's Festival, expanding the single day into a multi-day event of concerts, street theatre, outdoor spectacles, and international performances. The parade grew from a modest civic procession into a major artistic event, with elaborate floats and performances commissioned from artists across the world. The Taoiseach, the Irish Prime Minister, began making annual visits to Washington to present the President of the United States with a bowl of shamrocks, a piece of diplomatic soft power so charming in its complete unpretentiousness that it generated warmer coverage than most formal state visits could manage. Today, the Irish government's St. Patrick's Day greening initiative illuminates landmarks on every continent in emerald light on the 17th of March. The Sydney Opera House goes green, the pyramids of Giza go green, the Eiffel Tower, the Leaning Tower of Pisa, Niagara Falls, the Christ the Redeemer statue in Rio de Janeiro, landmarks in cities Patrick himself could not have imagined existing. More than 500 sites in over 50 countries participate. An estimated 13 million people around the world attend parades and celebrations. 70 million people globally claim Irish ancestry. Whatever else it has become, the holiday that grew from one man's conviction on a hillside in County Antrim has achieved a reach that no single life should plausibly be able to generate. Here is the thing about St. Patrick that is so easy to lose sight of. Buried beneath all the green and the legend and the global spectacle, Patrick was not Irish. He was Romano-British, born somewhere in what is now England or Wales, the product of a Romanized family with roots in the administrative and clerical class of a dying empire. He came to Ireland in chains, not by choice. He spent his life on that island because a dream told him to return to the people who had enslaved him, and he believed the dream. The patron saint of Ireland was Irish by adoption and conviction rather than by birth, which makes his story more interesting, not less. There is also the matter of what his mission actually accomplished. Patrick brought Christianity to Ireland, and Christianity changed Ireland profoundly in ways both generative and destructive. The monastic tradition that emerged from his mission produced the Book of Kells and preserved much of what we know about the ancient world. It also, over the long centuries, displaced the Druidic learning that had maintained Irish culture and law and history through oral tradition for millennia. Some of that ancient learning was absorbed and preserved in Christian manuscripts. Some was lost. The world that Patrick found when he returned to Ireland was a sophisticated one, with its own complex intellectual and spiritual tradition, and it did not survive his mission entirely intact. The American celebration, meanwhile, exists in a relationship with history that is worth acknowledging honestly. The green beer and the plastic shamrocks and the novelty hats bear very little resemblance to anything recognizably Irish, either ancient or contemporary. The corned beef came from a Jewish deli. The river is dyed because a plumber noticed what his dye did to water. The celebration has, in many of its commercial expressions, become a collection of stereotypes that most actual Irish people regard with a mixture of affection and mild exasperation. And yet, at the root of all of it, underneath the layers of commerce and kitsch and enthusiastic misappropriation, there is something real. The Irish-American parade was not entertainment. It was defiance. It was performed by people who had crossed an ocean in the hold of a ship, who had watched their families die in Irish ditches, who had arrived in a country that posted signs telling them they were not wanted, and who marched anyway, who put on whatever green they could find and walked through the streets of cities that had told them to make themselves invisible, and made themselves as visible as they possibly could. We are here. We have survived. We will not disappear. That is Patrick's legacy, ultimately. Not the snakes, not the shamrock, not the illuminated Eiffel Tower. A stubborn insistence on continuing in the face of everything that argues for giving up. The boy who prayed on the hillside in the rain. The man who came back to the country that had broken him. The church that copied books while empires burned. The emigrants who carried a feast day across an ocean and turned it into something the world could not ignore. The thread runs unbroken from that cold Irish hillside to the green river in Chicago, to the lit-up pyramids of Giza, and it is made of something that has no better name than refusal. It is also worth noting that the holiday's global reach reflects something specific about the Irish experience that goes beyond sentiment. The Irish diaspora is one of the largest and most widely distributed in the world. An estimated 70 to 80 million people outside Ireland claim Irish descent. That number dwarfs the population of Ireland itself several times over. It is a diaspora created largely by catastrophe, by the series of famines, political upheavals, and economic failures that made staying in Ireland impossible for generation after generation across 2 centuries. When those people left, they brought March the 17th with them, and wherever they settled in sufficient numbers, they kept it alive. The holiday's global presence is, in this sense, a map of Irish suffering as much as a map of Irish celebration. It is the 17th of March somewhere in the world right now. In Dublin, the pipe bands are finishing their last sets in Temple Bar, the music finally giving way to the particular quiet that falls over a city when a long day of celebration has exhausted itself. In New York, the last stragglers are leaving Fifth Avenue, the green streamers and dropped programs slowly being cleared by the overnight crews. In Sydney, Melbourne, Buenos Aires, Tokyo, the green lights that lit the landmarks are being switched off one by one as midnight passes through each time zone in turn. And somewhere, if you are very quiet and very willing to imagine, there is a hillside in the north of Ireland. The wind is moving through the long grass. The sheep are settling for the night. The sky overhead is the particular Irish sky that seems both very close and impossibly far, packed with stars that look cold and very clear. And on that hillside, 15 centuries ago, a boy who had lost everything was finding, in the silence and the loneliness, something that he would spend the rest of his life trying to give away. He could not have known what would come of it. The manuscripts and the missionaries, the famine ships, the Fifth Avenue parade, the river running green in an American city. He was a teenager on a hillside, tending sheep in the rain, praying because prayer was the only thing that was entirely his own. That is where it all began. One man, one hillside, one act of stubborn, improbable faith. The world has a great many holidays. Most of them celebrate victories, births, harvests, or the founding of nations. St. Patrick's Day is unusual in that it celebrates, if you trace it to its source, a defeat turned inside out, a slavery that became a vocation, a catastrophe that became a community, a diaspora that would not be erased. Whatever you make of the theology, whatever you think of the green beer, the story underneath the celebration is one of the more remarkable in human history. A boy was taken from his home in chains, found something on a hillside that he could not leave behind, and came back to give it away. The rest, across 15 centuries, is the world trying to understand what he left. Thank you for listening. Good night and sleep well.